Is there any connection between truth and justice? We hear so much nowadays about justice, about social justice, about economic justice, reproductive justice, but we're living in a time when there's a paradigm shift in education and our view of learning, that we don't really have objective truth to pursue, but there's only subjective truths that we hold or have preferences about. Now, put on your thinking cap with me, because on today's edition of Truth for a New Generation, we're going to talk about learning, education, but we're going to look at the concept of whether or not there's any truth to learn and any truth to amend our lives around. We'll also have a conversation with a department head at a major American university. This and much more, because truth and culture impacts you and me and all of us. Stay tuned to this edition of Truth for a New Generation. Hi, welcome to Truth for a New Generation. Alex McFarland here. So glad that you're watching. When you talk about lofty subjects like truth, I mean, very often people assume that's just the purvey of philosophers or thinkers, and it's so abstract, we might ask ourselves, does it really have any application to my life? Well, as you know, if you watch the Truth for a New Generation broadcast, you look at our short form videos on YouTube and social media, we talk about history and culture. We talk about apologetics, we talk about the Bible, but we talk about truth, because truth really does matter. And this is not just the lofty ivory tower stuff that philosophers deal with. Truth cuts to the very fabric of reality and how you and I live. Now, traditionally, the definition of truth is it's the way things really are. It's the way things are. The big 85-cent word for our view of truth, or the view of most people throughout history, has been correspondence. Truth is that which corresponds to reality. Nowadays, we hear so much about justice. We frankly hear a lot about injustice. And groups and lobbyists are on television always crying about this or that is unjust. It's not fair. We demand justice. We demand that things be made right. Well, on this program, I want to, before we wrap, talk about the connection between truth and justice, because we're living in a time of not correspondence, that truth corresponds to reality, but we're living in a time of relativism, that I make my own truth. If we say something is wrong, that's morally wrong. That's sinful. Oh my goodness, the world will push back and say, well, that's your truth, that's not my truth. But listen, in a world where nothing is true and therefore nothing is false, hang with me. If we're going to be consistent, we've got to admit that nothing is truly just, therefore nothing is truly unjust. So for all of the people that are crying justice, I want this, I want reproductive justice, I want the legal right, the protection to do anything I want, and if I don't get my way, that's unjust. Well, listen, if you've built for yourself a world of relativism where there is no absolute truth, it really makes no sense to say that something is just or unjust, right or wrong. There's no good or bad, there's just stuff. Now, there was a British historian and writer named George Trevelyan. He died in 1962. And he said this about modern education, and this was 60 years ago plus. But he said, modern education has given us masses of people that know how to read, but they don't know what's worth reading. Now think about that, because there's a lot of noise in the world. Sociologists use the term white noise. I mean, we're inundated with images and video and just a constant stream. And I've got to say this, rather than being a mind-numbed zombie who's just numbly going through this world of constant streaming, we have got to rise to the challenge and exert the energy and the effort to truly think, truly process, and truly pursue truth. William J. Bennett, years ago, he was in the Reagan administration, and he famously wrote that book of virtues. Bennett, who I've met many times, I've interviewed, I've been in seminars where he spoke, brilliant thinker. But William J. Bennett said, the purpose of education is to expand your mind and save your soul. What would he mean by that? The purpose of education is to, quote, expand your mind and save your soul. Well, to learn that there is truth to pursue, and there's even truth that in my own heart and life I've got to change and amend myself to pursue. In other words, there's right to live and there's wrong to avoid, and there's wrong from which we repent of having done. To learn and to know God. That's the ultimate goal of truth. Stay tuned. More on Truth for a New Generation. Welcome back to Truth for a New Generation. We're talking about truth, and we're talking about the reality of living with a belief that there is or isn't truth. And we're going to talk now about how that relates to education. And I'm so excited to have a friend and a colleague on set with me today, Dr. Brett Nolker. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you for having me.
You and I share a lot of mutual interests, one of which is music.
Absolutely.
And, so how did you get into education? And let's segue into that part of the conversation, but give us a little bit of your background.
Sure. Started out as a musician and was led to life as a public school teacher, going to be a school music teacher, band director originally. And through my own educational progress, had a series of student teachers who were coming to work with me who I was concerned about what they were getting. Okay. And a colleague of mine and I both decided that we should do something about that. So we went back to school to get into teacher education and led through my graduate study into the teacher training, teacher education side of what I'm doing. So I've spent now, 25 years in the preparation of public school music teachers primarily.
Now, when you did your PhD, what did you write your dissertation on?
Actually, in an area that was very, very specific because it was easy to measure, and that is in the processes we use for music reading instruction. Okay. So which also kept me solidly in the education world. My PhD is actually in curriculum and instruction, not in music. So,
but that's important. That's basic stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
So this is going to sound like a very rudimentary question. What is education? Is there one definition?
No, no. There's not one definition.
And you can tell I'm leading. I know there's not one definition. So talk to me about education.
My broadest definition, and honestly, it is even broad enough to be secularized, would be the exchange between a teacher and learner of knowledge and skills that the learner can continue with. I was prepared in a program that followed a very, at the time, forward-thinking but very progressivist model of education. We were prepared in the constructivist model, and in that learners, it's based on the idea that learners build their own knowledge. They don't take the knowledge of the teacher. The teacher's not there to fill an empty head. They're believing that the learner brings something with them and that the learner builds new learning on their past experiences. Mm-hmm. My position has progressed, and it's actually, I'm proud to say, built on what I think of as Jesus' teaching model. Okay. Which is one of basing learning on transfer. It's taking an area of thought from one area and being able to use it in another area.
Isn't that Christian discipleship, really?
Absolutely.
That it's life-on-life transfer.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
we've all probably, or maybe if you're old enough, you've heard that little rhyme, reading, writing, arithmetic, taught to the tune of a hickory stick.
Yes.
You know, there was this time that education was the teacher and rote memorization and learning of facts that the student previously did not know.
Yes.
And I think most moms and dads assume that's what's going on with their kids in school.
No.
What do parents need to know about modern education?
First of all, that we are in a time of major change and rethinking. I would say Americans tend to go back to a time in the early 20th century and say that that was a time of major change. I kind of disagree. I think while, for instance, names like John Dewey we can go back and say, yes, there was major development or growth in education at the time. I think we're actually experiencing a more significant change because it's broader based right now. And it would go back to a shift that would be a response to maybe even as far back as what we now would think of as the age of reason time. The main change and main shift we're seeing is that schools are proudly changing belief systems in their learners. They're not teaching facts and knowledge. We're actually preparing teachers to directly confront and change belief systems in the learners.
And I want you to emphasize this. I want the viewers to get this. So you're saying it's not about the acquisition of previously unknown facts,
right,
but it's about changing values.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Why is that significant? Because
it's based in worldview education. Honestly, they wouldn't use that terminology. There has been a push in recent years where they actually use the term values education.
As in morals?
They wouldn't use that terminology usually. Matter of fact, they'd shy away from that terminology. But yes, in fact, that's actually what's happening. Truthfully, the learner's being taught how to think rather than what to think. And for me, that means they've stepped broadly into the world I'm comfortable with. They're actually teaching worldview.
Yeah, worldview.
And if so, then Christian parents and students need to be aware that they're now dealing directly with things that impact our belief system, and that therefore we need to be deciding about where we learn and what we learn so that it aligns with belief system.
Is truth something we discover, or is truth something that we define for ourselves? To the modern educator.
To the modern educator, actually, they would question if there's a concept of truth as a foundation. For those of us who do believe there can be objective truth, then where we find the objective truth would be one stage of this that I think is important. That's being changed, where we look to for truth.
Right. Yeah. And of course, you and I are both Christians.
Yes.
And I believe God exists. God has revealed himself to the world. And, and you know, there are some things in life that are subjective preferences. One day I have strawberry ice cream. One day I have vanilla. You know, they're value judgments. But I believe there are some objective moral realities that are true whether I believe it or not.
Yes. Yes.
But most secular modern education would reject that, wouldn't they?
Interestingly, they would loudly reject that if they were responding to you just then. But in rejecting that strongly, they're declaring their own objective truth.
And if we all make truth for ourselves, aren't I free to believe that there are some objective moral truths?
Until recently, yes. Yes. However, that world has changed loudly. I mean, we've all heard recently the use of the term virtue signaling all over in the especially secular media. that concept, when carried into the learning environment, is that there are acceptable beliefs and unacceptable beliefs, and that the learner should align with the new acceptable belief.
Wow, this is huge, and this may be the single biggest nugget that I want viewers and especially parents to know. Okay, in a world of subjectivism,
Yes.
relativism,
Yes.
we all have our own opinion.
Yes.
And yet, wait a minute, there are some unacceptable beliefs.
Absolutely.
So, in this world of tolerance, is it fair to say that if we are selective in our tolerance, we're actually intolerant?
Absolutely. Yes. That's being formalized right now, which for me is, my students would laugh that I would talk to you about this too. They're used to me saying this almost daily. I think we're living through a major historical shift right now. And the way I describe it to my students is we're living between music history books. That we have been firmly in the newest, let's say, Norton Music History series.
Right.
The latest Norton book would yet be unnamed. 20th Century was the last one that was published.
Right.
So what's the new one? We don't know. We're actually living in the time between two history books right now, which makes the upheaval, the kind of the scary to be out in the unknown feel. We are watching the new text become established in the learning environment.
Well, as long as they still say the Beatles and Brian Wilson were the best musicians and composers and arrangers of the 20th century, I'll be happy. No, hey, I got to ask you this. There's something called the law of composition. The parts make up the whole.
Yes.
Well, if masses of humanity get their degree believing there is no truth but my truth,
Yes.
What's that going to mean for the culture at large?
Right now, I think personal distress is the first level. People are searching for what is going to satisfy that longing that they're having. And for the first time, at least in my life and recent history, they're being actively discouraged from finding the solutions to that. They're being taught that the solution to resolving that longing is a direct personal responsibility to change it yourself, whether it's change your body or change your processes. They're not being told that there is someone there that actually has the answer for them.
Is all of this relativism setting us free or actually further binding us?
At least binding. My concern is it's blinding them. No one lives without worldview. Everyone wakes every day and lives through their day based solidly in their worldview, especially if they're unconscious of it. They're not aware of it. Mm-hmm. And an education system that's formally in place to undercut and weaken the foundations of someone's worldview is blinding them. And for someone like me who believes that their learning can be based on transferring one area to another, when we weaken the structure so that there is nothing to transfer, or we break the bonds that would transfer, then we're actually blinding that child in the building of their worldview. It's a strong concern for me right now.
Is there a way that those of us who do believe in God, we believe in objective truth, those of us who are Christians, is there a way that God and Christianity can be reinserted back into the educational conversation?
It is being carefully structured to not allow that in the traditional learning environment right now. And I'm not speaking negatively about our institutions necessarily. They're not doing it individually maliciously. So that teacher at home.
It's almost like a wave they're riding, and it's a wave they didn't necessarily know they were a part of.
Yes. And especially the individual teacher in the individual classroom. You know, the teacher at home that's dealing with your second grader isn't dealing with worldview education maliciously on purpose. But when the worldview itself is deconstructed, and when the system itself is teaching new relativist models, the system itself becomes broken then.
We've only got about 30 seconds left, but Professor, give us a homework assignment. What would you advise us to do to learn more about this?
I think parents and students need to be very cautious and take as their homework the finding out of the healthiest place and way to learn in their own lives, to take ownership for themselves of where they learn.
Take ownership of themselves of where they learn. Dr. Brett Nolker, I want to thank you. You know, that kind of reminds me of that famous thought of Mortimer Adler that we have to do the heavy lifting of critical thinking. Stay tuned to Truth for a New Generation. We'll do our best to help you do that. Don't go away. George Veith, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Veith, I hope I am, but he is a culture editor at World Magazine. He was a dean at Concordia University in Wisconsin, and he made an interesting statement about the connection between truth and justice. Veith said the following: to be free, one must have the critical thinking skills that inoculate against the alluring rhetoric that pervades contemporary society, rhetoric that is constantly seeking to undermine freedom for the sake of varied, narrow interests. Now think about that alluring rhetoric. We're being told that, you know, there is no objective truth. We make truth for ourselves. And ultimately, friends, this hyper-relativism that, as we learned about in our conversation with Dr. Brett Nolker, it's not completely uniform. See, that's one thing about human beings. We're not consistent. We hear about tolerance, and yet the tolerance that's being imposed on society is a very selective tolerance. When a Christian comes along and says, look, God exists, therefore atheism is false. God is the foundation of moral truth, righteousness, therefore some things are wrong. There is justice, there is therefore injustice. There is righteousness, there is sin. Well, when the world says, no, don't impose your beliefs on us, that selective tolerance is really intolerance. And parents need to know that their secular classroom, K through 12, then college, post-grad studies, unless you go to a solidly Christian university, I can promise you, your students are not going to be in the pursuit of facts, at least not consistently, but it's more, as Dr. Nolker said, and as we've talked about on the show before, it's more about narrative and values and, yes, worldview. I want to give you a quote here. Veith was quoting someone named Daniel Scoggin, CEO of Great Heart. Now, Great Heart is a network of classical schools, but Veith goes on, and he gives this quote. He reminds his constituency that each generation must, quote, earn their freedom anew. So Veith, quoting another educator, Daniel Scoggins, says each generation must earn their freedom anew. The founding fathers of America talked about the animated contest of freedom, and whether we were going to look to the government to be the nanny, the God, if we were going to passively just look for handouts from the government. And as Mortimer Adler that we quote, Adler challenged people 60 years ago to not live your life, quote, as a vegetable beneficiary of someone else, but to get out there and work and learn. And let me say, friend, this is part of our duty to God, not only to work and be moral and live a life of truth and righteousness, but to expand your mind and save your soul. Now, regarding learning, knowledge, wisdom, Proverbs 1 verse 7 says that it starts with this presupposition: God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I would say we're unraveling as a culture because we've abandoned God. We're not learning. We're becoming dull. We're becoming subliterate. And we're becoming a culture of anarchy because we've lost the foundation of order and truth, which is God. How do we find our way back? Each one of us making that commitment. Maybe even the Lord is calling you to that commitment now. God bless you, and I challenge you to be a seeker of truth. Welcome back. Hey, truth. It's so vitally important. It really is a matter of life and death. Truth and what you believe is really a matter of eternity, because we are to build our souls on truth. A few years ago, I had the privilege of going to New York City. I was on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and John Oliver. And after the program, we were sitting back in the green room. They were very nice to me, and they interviewed me, and they poked fun at me and made fun of Christianity a little bit. But I felt like it was a great honor to be up there and to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. But after the filming, we're back there with Jon Stewart and all the crew of Comedy Central, and they were saying, come on, you Christians, you believe that you got to know Jesus and you believe the Bible is the Word of God. Do you really think that's true? And it dawned on me something to say. We were eating a meal together at Comedy Central, and I said, hey, look, isn't the body designed to operate in certain ways? I mean, you eat good nutrition, the 5 food groups, that's healthy. You eat paint chips, that's unhealthy. Good nutrition, physically beneficial. Poisons, toxins, detrimental. So I asked this question. I said, isn't it at least possible? I'm not saying it's actual, but isn't it at least possible if the body operates within a certain set of parameters, isn't it at least possible that the soul operates within certain parameters? You feed on goodness, truth, morals, love, righteousness, spiritually beneficial. You believe things that are false, lies, selfishness, narcissism, hatred, indulgence, sin, that's spiritually detrimental. And because even those in the room that weren't Christians, everybody said, okay, there's a body, there's a soul. If there are things that are physically beneficial, couldn't there also be things that are spiritually beneficial? And that led the way to a conversation about the Bible and God and truth. I want to encourage you to be a person willing to build relationships and talk with people about spiritual matters and truth. We want to help you do that. I publish a newsletter every month. I write articles right now. Even as we record this, the next newsletter is going to be an article I'm writing on 7 prayers God has always promised to answer with a yes. So if you go to my website, which is alexmcfarland.com, you can sign up for the newsletter. I do want to remind you that we also do a podcast with our friend and colleague, Reverend Odell Cleveland. And the podcast I do with Odell Cleveland is called I Hear Ya. And you can find it wherever you listen to podcasts and digital learning. It is awesome. We're similar, but we're different. And so I Hear Ya, we talk about a lot of volatile issues. So check out that podcast. Check out my book, The Assault on America, How to Defend Our Nation Before It's Too Late. You can find it anywhere and everywhere online and in bookstores. But I want to thank you for watching, and I want to challenge you to get out of your comfort zone, get out there on the front line and talk to people and stand up for truth. And we're here to help you do that. So thanks for watching. May God bless you.